So one of the triggers of the Industrial Revolution in the United States was this huge, this was agriculture. And so you have all this product. Last time I had a similar slide for the textile industry, with all the little invention of the textile industry that eventually generate a lot of profit, and you have the boom of cotton and so on. And here, it's a different kind of slide. It's for agriculture. Now, that's not the only story. The United States was blessed with a number of things. Each of them caused a boom. So you have a series of booms. The critics will call them bubbles. This will become a country of one bubble after the other, right? One boom after the other. It always depends if you see the glass half full or half empty. But think of gold. 1848, gold is discovered in California, and the United States becomes one of the biggest producers of gold. Anyone with a pen can search for gold. That's fantastic. That's almost... Suddenly you discover that actually gold digging is one of the most democratic things. And so of course you have thousands of people coming from all over, because anybody can dig for gold. Mass migration. 92% of California's population is male in 1850.
Still is in some parts.
Still is in Silicon Valley. Well, the population was not that big back then. So gold moves the center of mass of the United States. How would you get to California from New York back then? 6 months by horse carriage, going through some dangerous areas. Or 6 months by sail ship around Cape Horn. There's no Panama Canal. Or through Panama, but without the canal. One steamship takes you to Panama, then you cross on foot or horse, then you take another steamship to San Francisco. The first express services are born. Pony Express is very famous, but actually lasted only 1 year. And eventually the Transcontinental Railway. So indirectly that was very important to develop the United States. So the railroad in Britain, if you remember, mainly it's transporting coal. That was the big thing, transporting coals. The first railways were not even on steel, they were on wood. Here it's a much bigger project actually. And then the time for 6 months goes down to 10 days from New York to San Francisco. Note, in 1820, and this is a nice trivia, it had taken a month for President Andrew Jackson to travel by horse from Nashville to Washington. When he was elected, he had to travel to Washington. It took him 1 month to reach Washington. And because the telegraph didn't exist, I don't know if in Washington they knew which day it was coming. Okay? One day he shows up, knocks at the White House. I'm here, new president. Anyway, the benefit of the railroads to transport people and goods is obviously, well, today is obvious. Back then it became obvious. By 1910, United States are 1/3 of all railroads in the world.
In Europe, are they using rail for, like, people? Or is it still primarily like cold delivery at that point?
Yeah, at this point, railroads are spreading. But to give you an idea, France had a huge network of canals. So the motivation to build the railroads was not that big.
Right.
And Southern Europe was not developed at that point. I suspect the Ottomans had more networks, more railroads than Southern European countries. So railroads also create another boom. What do you need to build railroads? I mean, besides poor Chinese immigrants. If you look at I recommend visiting the tunnels. They're near Lake Tahoe. I don't remember the name. Those tunnels were blasted through granite by Chinese. Lots of Chinese immigrants lured to the Americas with the promise that you will be digging gold, and instead they were making tunnels for the railroad. Anyway, still, I mean, those huge, long railways needed a lot of steel. coal, engineering, tunnels, bridges, and so on. Eventually the telegraph becomes very important to communicate with the train stations. And the stations, and then stations become entire towns. Think of Palo Alto. It was a train station.
Oh, really? That's like
Yeah.
how it started?
Stanford owned the railway,
Huh.
and they picked Stanford near. He built a university near that train depot. And it's railroad companies actually that create the 4 time zones of the United States. So very important because they are the ones that unite the East and West. At that point the government didn't have the power to unite East and West. The government was East. And the economic and political power was East. It's the railroads that really create one nation. Create one global market for goods, and this will benefit hugely California. We'll see it shortly. So and they do what? They create the big corporation. They require huge investments, extend over a huge distributed area, require a sophisticated system of planning and managing, did cost analysis and so on. If I didn't write railroads require this thing, you would have said big corporations. Any big corporation does. Today, yes. Any big corporation learned from the railroads. So anyway, the other boom that starts is steel. There's a new way to make steel that becomes very popular in the United States, and in particular in the Great Lakes region, because that's where you get the coal and the iron. And then, Andrew Carnegie in particular starts making steel in Pittsburgh. And these are another example of big corporation. In that case, you want to control everything from the mines to the finished product. Then it becomes a vertical kind of organization. And in 1900, the largest company in the world is a steel company, steel manufacturing company. The other boom that comes with the railroads and comes with the big organizations eventually, communication. We need to communicate. It's a huge country. How do you communicate? Not a coincidence that the telegraph gets invented, perfected, whatever. We can argue forever who invented this thing, who was the first one to do it. But Morse invents the code. That's not the detail. Maybe he didn't invent. Maybe he wasn't the first one to think of using electricity to send signals, but he invents a code. Without a code, that's useless. With a code, that becomes very useful. So very important. Use electricity. Actually, that's before Maxwell. We didn't know how electricity works. That's not the inventor who just know that there is electricity, and you can do something with it. Imagine you sending a message before Morse in some regions would take months. Now it takes minutes. Yeah, 1775, Britain learned of the revolution. The King of Britain learned of the revolution in the United States more than a month after it had started.
Oh, wow.
That was normal, okay? Things needed a ship to go there and tell the king, oh, by the way, I forgot one thing. There's a revolution in America. On the other hand, December 1848, the president made the mistake of announcing that gold had been found in California. That generated the gold rush instantly. Instantly the whole country, which really means the country east of the Appalachians, the whole country learns gold, and
Yeah.
So that tells you the difference that the telegraph, just a few years later, difference that it makes. And then within a few years you have the first transnational telegram, and that becomes the second biggest communication revolution in information technology. And that's when they start talking about the virtual movement of information replacing the physical movement of people. That is true. With the telegraph, it's the first way that you can actually send a message instead of sending the person to do the same thing. Rudimentary, because you can't really send huge amount of data with the telegraph. It's not that feasible. But that begins the revolution, And from today's point of view, what's the telegraph? Digital. It's the beginning of the digital world, in a sense. So it was a big thing. So it comes from the railroads. Transportation, communication used to travel together, but now actually there are two different businesses. One is the railroad, one is the telegraph, and each will evolve in different ways. Born together, but eventually they will decouple and become two different stories. So, not surprisingly, the whole thing of communication and of information skyrockets. You have newspapers, magazines, whatever you want to call them. One big thing, cheaper paper, I don't remember exactly why, probably just more industrialization. But the steam-powered printing press makes a big deal. It starts in New York and makes printing so cheap that ordinary people can afford it. Don't forget that in Europe, at that time, a newspaper was something you would find in the club. People would be members of a club. They would go, or maybe a cafe, but you wouldn't buy it. You would go there and read it there. So it had a very limited audience, and it was probably expensive enough that ordinary people wouldn't even think of buying it. With a steam-powered printing press, you can print thousands of copies, maybe hundreds of thousands already. Okay, and that makes it affordable for everybody. And as we said, the United States at this point has already become the most literate country in the world. So there is actually an audience for that medium. And faster transportation. You can actually transport the New York Times by railroad in 10 days to California. you have post office everywhere. Anyway, so yeah, I wasn't sure which newspaper, the New York Herald, first mass market daily newspaper, and that's when new things are introduced in newspapers. The newspaper used to be really about the King of France said that the King of Britain is an idiot. That was the big news. Sometimes the war. 10 days ago, a war started in the Ottoman Empire. But this is where they start thinking, well, since this is going to be read by ordinary people, what do ordinary people care about? The weather, sports, That's where it's really born. And of course, thanks to the telegraph, you can also have news about the foreign world without having to wait, weeks or months. Advertising is born. Now, another big story is lighting. Philadelphia pioneered the gaslight. Gaslight was becoming also popular in Europe, particularly in London and Berlin. And that was another important revolution because it extended the day, especially in winter, and when days are short, you could stay up till later and do things. So one thing that happens is a boom of books, magazine, newspaper. That's just people have the time for these things. But the other thing that happens is that people get addicted to having lighting in the street and eventually in their homes. And the other one also central heating. In colder area, that also made a difference. You would go to sleep early without good heating. With central heating, you can stay up till late and not freeze to death. Now, oil. So, oil actually is a consequence of lighting. Because back then, lighting, so after gas, whale oil became the big thing. And whale oil, for a while, was cheap, widely available, whatever, but then we ran out of whales. and so whale oil became extremely expensive. So they needed a replacement. What was the replacement? Kerosene. Kerosene that was made of plenty, of something that was plenty, still plenty. So they made kerosene and eventually developed from crude oil. That became the big thing for lighting. Now there was a significant fire risk that was not good. So there was a search for something that can replace gas, whale oil, kerosene. What could that be? Anyway, the huge demand for kerosene triggered really the oil rush. Because if you think of it, I assume you heard of Edwin Drake drilling oil in Pennsylvania. What most people don't immediately realize that there were no cars in 1859. That's easily 60 years before the Ford, you know. So why was it a big deal that they discovered oil? Lighting. The big thing was lighting, actually. Technology was triggered, by the way. As it's, in most of these cases, you have to wonder why nobody did it before. Because technology is the technology that they used for drilling salt. There was nothing special. There was no need for oil. If you found oil in your backyard, you would curse. Okay? At this point, oil is becoming important because as kerosene, it's a major commodity. It's something that most of people want. So 1862, when Rockefeller started doing things, 1882 is when the Standard Oil is created. There's no cars. People sometimes don't make the connection. There's no cars. This became a big company, one of the biggest companies in the world, but there's no cars. Oil was not actually for cars. Oh, gasoline, even better. I don't know if I had it on one of the slides. Gasoline was thrown away. It was a byproduct of refining kerosene, and gasoline was garbage, thrown away. It has no use. Now things will change, actually I was wrong, yeah, 1908. So this will change when cars are invented, and particularly when that car is introduced. Then the search for oil becomes another story. Then people start realizing oil can also be important for something else. And trivia, that's when they first find oil in the Middle East. But at that point, California was lucky again. Not only the gold rush, but also the oil rush. At this point, California is the biggest oil producer in the world. So the car was actually invented in Germany, and industrial leadership went to France. You know that most of the cars in California at the beginning of the last century were made in France. You know why France? To this day, the chassis of the car, you know, there's a lot of, the chauffeur is the guy who drives the car. If you think of it, you come up, one day we wrote it down, but I don't remember all of that. But there's a carburetor, okay? Why France? It's actually intriguing. You have to go back, this is trivia, it's not there. Even the United States, a lot of the early car manufacturers were actually bicycle manufacturers, because that's, you know, it was sort of a natural extension. First the motorcycle, and then the four-wheel thing. And it turns out France had the leadership in bicycles. But now the question is, why France had the leadership in bicycles? Bicycles need paved roads. Britain didn't need to pave the roads. It had the railways. France didn't have railways, so it paved the roads. And it used a lot of bicycles. So indirectly, it's one of those cases where you're backwards, but actually it turns out to be an advantage with the next major revolution. So it actually, you know, they had a lot of bicycle manufacturers for that reason. And many of them went on to found car manufacturing companies. And so they had actually most of the market at the very beginning of the 20th century, before Ford and the others started the big revolution in Detroit. So anyway, Ford, then then General Motors, the assembly line, and so on and so on. So the assembly line is the big thing, actually. I was thinking of the assembly line, not just of the Model T. And that was inspired by the meat packing factories. And that's another interesting story, because so Chicago had become the hub for the meat industry. You know, cattle would come from Texas, Kansas, whatever, then turn into meat in Chicago, and then thanks to the railways, that's also another indirect effect of the railway, it would be shipped all over the country. The big innovation was when Swift invented the refrigerating car, which today is normal. Back then it wasn't, and it was not a detail. That's why in the movies you see they load the all the cattle in the train and they ship the cattle. They couldn't slaughter the cattle in Texas because the meat would arrive rotting in Chicago. So you had to send physically the cattle where the slaughterhouses were. With the invention of the refrigerating car, a lot of things change. And one thing that changes is that you can ship fruit. Okay? Which state was the biggest producer of fruit, like citrus, that nobody knew?
Florida?
No, well, probably maybe Florida at that point, but California. California, Orange County. Okay, but until this date, they could not ship it anywhere else. You had to eat your oranges. Yeah. So the railway reaches Los Angeles in 1887. First cool shipment of fruit from California to the east. So California had the gold rush, the oil rush, and now actually less discussed, but the agricultural rush. And California is still one of the biggest agricultural powers in the world to this day. In 1914, another big thing, Panama Canal shortens the journey to California. I was saying, from New York, you have to either go all around or go to Panama, take a horse, cross Panama, take another steamship, go to San Francisco. With the Panama Canal, all this gets a lot faster. So at this point, you have the railroad, transcontinental railroad, and you can ship goods also by ship. California produces 57% of the oranges, 70% of the prunes, so I think it beats Florida big time, actually. So it's the biggest producer of oil in the world, as we said. The gold rush is gone by now. Gold rush lasted very little, but the gold rush left behind things like San Francisco, Stanford University. It was not a detail, and some other things. I think I have a slide that talks about that. Los Angeles develops also a lot because of this gentleman, Huntington, who had this great idea of creating the suburbia. You know, you create public transportation that will bring people outside the center and create more and more and more communities. So you invest in the land, bring people there, the land values go up, I make a lot of money. My main investment is really this network of public transportation. And a lot of the immigrants into Los Angeles were actually not poor. They were domestic immigrants, meaning coming from the Midwest or the East Coast, retiring in Los Angeles. And the film industry is being born. Okay, lots of California just because we are in California. But it is interesting. The wealth of California starts back then, and then it goes through so many weird transformations eventually, defense and then computers and smartphones and search engines and social media eventually. Anyway, so electricity is another big story. We'll take a break in about 10 minutes. Another big story. But by this point, Maxwell has explained electricity. There's great scientific foundations behind electricity. I have no idea how much Edison knew the science. Again, it's another inventor who is just inventing things. That was true of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. It is true of this new Industrial Revolution in the United States. It's people who don't really use science. Science comes after, not before. It does create a research laboratory, which is probably the first non-university research lab. And then, inventions that come out of that lab, the phonograph, the light bulb. This actually was not very successful. It's frequently portrayed next to a light bulb, but his light bulb wasn't very useful. Somebody else perfected it with a tungsten thing. Built the first power plant, though that's developed, it's really the first one. I'll tell you in a second which is a contender. Direct current. He was using direct current, so it wasn't very useful. But he already had the idea that you can transport electricity, and he was thinking mainly of factories. First line office building, so eventually becomes General Electric. At the same time, Westinghouse came out with a great idea. Alternative current was already known, and Faraday had invented a transformer and lots of other things. So the technology was there. he understands that alternating current is better for transporting high voltage electricity. That's what we use today. But anyway, in these years, basically, you have the foundation for General Electric and Westinghouse that will remain two of the biggest electrical and then electronic companies in the world. Now, that's the contender. If you go to Folsom, there's still a power plant there. So in California, actually, the Livermore company, I think they were brothers, opened a power plant to bring electricity from Folsom to Sacramento with water on the Sacramento River powering the generators. It's still there. You can go and see it. So that's a contender because it's 1895 and it brings electricity to a major city. The inauguration was the Grand Electrical Carnival in Sacramento. There's lots of pictures about this. Do you know this about Folsom? Yeah. Anyway, what is happening then? That lots of inventions, but some of them get consolidated, and more importantly, when you have the Industrial Revolution puts a lot of pressure on economies of scale and transportation, communication, all the things we discussed. Yeah, in theory they were available to everybody, but of course you need to have a steam-powered printing press to print thousands of copies. You need to have your own telegraph to send messages. You need to have your own railroad and so on. So it's not trivial. And so no surprise that some of these fields saw the emergence of a big corporation that dominates, monopolies. That's by the end of that century, you will have big companies. I'm saying the same thing. Yeah, and this happens. These big companies are born either because of vertical integration, like having the coal mine, the iron factories, and then the railroad, and you have the whole system, vertical or horizontal, where companies merge and merge and merge and merge, and then get bigger and bigger. But at the end, you have oil, standard oil, rubber, metals, you have steel, electrical, General Electric, Westinghouse. So it gets consolidated into big companies. That's new. The United States wasn't born this way. It was born, if I ask you what was the biggest business in the United States in 1950, 1820, 1800. So that's when you have the emergence of the big corporation.
Were there giant corporations forming in Europe too? Or
not to this extent.
Okay. Why not in Europe?
Because I don't think the economy of scale compared with this.
Just so much more land and resources to create.
And market. And a huge free trade market. Europe was not a free trade market, a free market, unified market until the European Union was created. So big difference. See, I was thinking, what about the colonial corporations? Those were big. Like East India Corporation. Those were big, but we're not talking about the same thing, right? Yeah. It's not. This is industrial. So in terms of industrial, any big industry in Britain, of course, was big because Britain was a major power, but it was pretty much limited to Britain because the rest of the British Empire probably absorbed very little. So that's always. So rise of the giant corporations. And same also in, I call it information empires, but same with the telegraph, the telephone, the radio, the cinema. If you think of it, within a relatively few years from the invention, there's one or a few companies that monopolize. Western Union for the telegraph, Bell, now AT&T for the telephone. The radio had 2 major stations back then, and cinema ended up being controlled by the Hollywood giants. So that's the birth of the big corporation, really, that before it didn't exist. And this is still domestic, it's a US corporation, but that will become the international corporations, multinational corporation. Now, I mentioned I think it was the first slide for the United States, was another big difference was how important the state was. A lot of the things that dramatically, that propelled, fueled those booms, one after the other, was actually designed by the government. I mean, first of all, the homestead, as I said, there was a big difference with Europe. The fact you can get a piece of land for free. That was unthinkable in Europe. Imagine how many Europeans came to the United States just hearing, what, I can get land for free?
Mm-hmm.
That's unheard. But then, just the first turnpike, the Erie Canal, that was extremely important to turn New York into what it is today. Transcontinental, very important to turn California what it is today. Dams, aqueducts, and the Panama Canal. So all of these were actually decisions by the government, and they made a huge difference for the U.S. economy. So the U.S. actually, I mean, if you read the biographies of the presidents, sometimes they're not the nicest people in the world. Sometimes they're slave owners or whatever. But most of the decisions they made, there was a big difference with Europe. Most of the decisions they made were pretty good decisions, actually. So anyway, because of all those things, whether it's luck of resources or the initiative of ordinary people or the government, eventually you have the middle class of the United States rises and rises and rises. So no surprise that the 50 million immigrants from Europe, no surprise at all. It's not just because of freedom and so on, it's just, life was better. So you start having the first appliances, the sewing machine, the washing machine, so on. That's also something that changes their lives. But back then, honestly, these things didn't become mass market things because almost everybody had a maid. Some of the maids were immigrants, like Irish maids that were famous back then. Some places they had the black maid. Sometimes they were just girls looking for a job, and it was normal to have a maid in the house. And also for the office, you start seeing the first machines for the office, and those are the precursor of today's digital machines. The first calculators. These are the big ones built for the government. It was built for a census, and some people consider it the first major computer. Not electronic, of course. Now, so that's a long story for the United States, and maybe we take the break here. You want to take a break here?
Mm-hmm.